So welcome everyone to this session of CODIFI, where we're going to speak about this wonderful new thing that we call data embassies. I have with me today Laura Kask. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Proud Engineers. My name is Gérardine Escolar. I'm the Deputy Secretary General of the Hague Conference on Private International Law. Welcome, Laura, and thank you so much for joining us. May I ask you perhaps to give us a little bit on your background, introduce yourself, and tell us how you got into data embassies in this whole space, please.
Hi everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to share my views and experience on creating the first data embassy in the world between Estonia and Luxembourg. Back in 2014, I joined Estonian government. Estonian government Chief Information Officer Taavi Kotka invited me to his team. I was the Chief Legal Officer, being responsible for IT-related regulations in Estonia, and one of my tasks was to create a data embassy. So this came to my table, and I was with the team from the very first days till 2018, when the bilateral agreement between two governments was ratified. And now I'm working at Proud Engineers, being the CEO of the company, and it's a consultancy company helping governments, large-scale organizations on their digitalization journey.
Well, I think you are the best person that we can have on for CODIFI for this. Then, as you know, we're really looking into digitalization of various different things, data transactions, assets across borders and so on. Now, just in light of the short time that we do have with you to share your expertise, Laura, this is an emerging area of the law, and I expect some of our audience will not have the extensive experience with the concept of data embassies. So a bit of a 101 question, if you will, Laura, could you explain to us what a data embassy is and what are they actually used for, please?
So to put it very simply, it's the application of a phenomenon from the private sector that has been used already for ages. Companies using data centers abroad for storage of digital data sets. And now the concept is transferred to public sector. I think the term data embassy sometimes frightens a bit, especially lawyers. And this was also something I came up when I was working with the project. But it refers to a set of servers that store a country's data and are under that country's jurisdiction while being located in another country. So in practice, this solution can be implemented by nation states to ensure the country's digital continuity with particular respect to critical databases that are essential for the functioning of the state.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. And it sounds like a pretty interesting, not so difficult concept, but perhaps you could help us with maybe a practical example of how something like that could be used. Do you have any experience perhaps with a practical application that you can share?
Yeah, it was in 2013 when the first active efforts were determined to establish the data embassy. And this was part of Estonian government cloud concept to establish those data embassies. And we tried to seek other like-minded countries whom we could collaborate, whom we could test this idea. And Luxembourg was the country that we chose to test this idea, to go through the legal framework and also the technical details of this concept. So I have been with this project from the very first day until the agreement was ratified by the parliaments. And there have been numerous discussions with different lawyers, technical people, visits to Luxembourg. But I would say that from the very first days, we had to sell the idea to Estonian government officials, of course, and also technical people, and then to other countries to find the best host. And only after then we could start working on the actual solution. And I'm more than happy that after several years of work, today we have many different governments and scholars discussing those topics, also wanting to establish their own data embassies. Today we got the news that Ukraine established also their data embassy. So now we have other countries following Estonia, the path of Estonia, and I'm more than happy that this concept has lived through those times, that now other countries are trying to adopt this as well.
Thank you. I think what's amazing about Estonia is that it really, as you mentioned, was the very first jurisdiction, the first country to really look into data embassies and establish something like that. Now, you've had, of course, many years of experience, walking it through your parliament and to your different stakeholders. I'm just wondering, could you tell us what is unique about the Estonian legal framework that facilitated the establishment of this data embassy? Perhaps tell us about, the Estonian digitized government infrastructure and where Estonia comes from and what's so special about the Estonian framework?
When I speak explicitly about the data embassy framework, then I think the uniqueness is that there were no major changes needed to establish the data embassy. So Estonian Public Sector Information Act already included the concept of hosting data and authorizing third parties to host data. But however, what we needed to update was the security standards to address hosting data abroad. And the information system owners to weigh the risks and understand what kind of data is suitable to be hosted in a data embassy. What I would like to emphasize is that the concept of hosting data abroad is not new. This has been done already for ages. Governments have been archiving data in their traditional embassies. And just that those buildings are not created for modern data storage means then we needed to create this data embassy concept. But where Estonia comes from, I think that one we can talk also for hours. We have more than 20 years of experience living in a digital society. Most of our services are online. There are only a few paper-based processes, but 98% of services are online. Almost 99% of people use electronic authentication and electronic signature every day. So this is where we come from, and this is also something why I believe the data embassy concept was needed. We understood that going back to paper-based processes is not an option, but at some point when we would need to understand who are our citizens or where to get our laws from, and if something happens with the data centers here in Estonia, then do we have proper storage and backups? And this was like the next layer of a digital government that those mechanisms should also be in place.
Yeah, I think Estonia is really a pioneer in this field. I mean, it's been so many years and really always at the forefront of technology. Now, you also did say that, you were looking around casting for a hosting state for this data embassy, and it was Luxembourg that was chosen. And I'm just wondering if you could share with us, what about the legal framework of the whole state of Luxembourg? What made that special for it to be the choice of the data embassy host?
I think one of the major issues was that they were already used to hosting data of large scale organizations, and that was why it wasn't very difficult to discuss those things with them, discuss those things with their lawyers. So we had the common and shared mindset. Mm-hmm. And I would say there wasn't much to be changed in their legislative system either. And I think one interesting aspect is that it appears that this has become a bit of their business model. So you might know that Luxembourg government is very business oriented, and this kind of data embassy service to be offered to other nations as well has become probably one of their services. But we Estonians were definitely very happy to be the first ones to test the concept with them.
So you mentioned that, of course, they're very business oriented. They already had a pretty good framework in place. Were there any efforts that were needed between Estonia and Luxembourg to harmonize the framework so that the arrangement could proceed? Or were there any technical limitations or legal limitations that you had to overcome?
I think considering the fact that our laws are relatively aligned, both countries being subject of EU legislation, it seems that that also the common mindset was there and understanding what could be done. We had discussions with other countries to host the data embassy as well, but I think with Luxembourg, our values and understanding of the concept seemed to be most identical. As for technical limitations, of course, we had to agree on the specific issues in form of the service level agreement. But however, this was also not a major hurdle because the service level they provided was a tier 4 data center. Technical people might understand what it is, but this is already a standard that gives you an understanding what kind of level is offered by the data center. Yes,
I see. That's actually really interesting, but I'm just wondering if we zoom out a little. Perhaps you talked about the other countries that Estonia also considered in the matter of hosting this data embassy and talked about different principles and ideas. But perhaps could you describe for us whether hosting or owning a data embassy would differ depending on the national legal framework, or whether, for example, it's a common law system or a civil law system or a mix, a Sharia law system? Is there a difference depending on the national legal framework?
I think I would like to leave this answer for every country to decide for themselves what their priorities are. But at the time, it was crucial for Estonia that the hosting data center would be at least majority owned by the hosting government. And you could understand why those requirements were very important for us, so that it would remain stable and reliable. And of course, in an ideal world, a country could just buy and own a whole data center abroad. But this, at least for most smaller countries, is not feasible resource-wise and also budget-wise. As for the difference in legal systems, there definitely can be differences. Some countries' legislation explicitly prohibits the storage of citizens' data abroad. On the other hand, I think on the EU level, regulations like GDPR have helped to unify regional standpoints. And the storage of citizens and other critical data is on the same level in legal terms within the EU. And one point that was raised by this whole discussion is that of data categorization. So what kind of data is critical for the functioning of the state, and what can be done with those data sets. So we have seen countries around the world that are still dealing with these decisions, and those must be done already before it's decided what data would be stored in a data embassy because of its critical importance. So it's very important to understand that it's not only personal or the data might be critical for the functioning of the state, but it might very easily be public data. So, for example, in Estonian case, our laws are public, they are published online, but it's very critical to the functioning of the state that these laws are up and running and accessible at all times. But there is no hurdle in hosting them abroad.
Of course, yeah, no, absolutely. I think, there you identified two, perhaps maybe not competing, but you have business efficacy on one hand. You need really stability in the infrastructure and the platform, so things have to be effective. And on the other hand, there's the public sector consideration of citizens' rights and privacy and various different things. Based on that, I mean, do you think public-private partnership might be one way to move projects like these forwards? And if so, what kind of public-private partnership would be ideal?
I think it's fair to say that this project was primarily a project between public sectors of Estonia and Luxembourg, but this brings me to a wider point of Estonian cloud policy, which I referred to earlier as well, which expressly allows the usage of private sector cloud providers also for some kind of data sets, depending on their status of importance and impact. And this is another area where governments around the world must do their decision. What data do we feel comfortable leaving with private sector companies? And on one hand, it can create legal disputes, of course, whether foreign agencies can access data hosted on servers of companies that are under foreign jurisdiction, as it clashes, for example, between EU countries and the US authorities, for example. But on the other hand, there may not be much of a choice because, quite frankly, most governments do not possess the resources to adequately host and protect their own databases on the same level as, for example, Microsoft or Google can do and protect the data. So it's also a matter of risk assessment matter of risk assessment.
Oh, absolutely. I think, there you've actually given me a nice pivot into the next point, really, which is really economic risk management, isn't it? As well as all the regulatory risk management. Now, we leave regulatory risk management out of the picture, and just really look at the economics and the private international law considerations of it. Of course, that the HCCH is looking at private international law considerations arising from issues like the data embassies. And based on your experience, Laura, how are private international law considerations, such as establishing the applicable law, determining jurisdictions across borders, recognizing and enforcing decisions, how are these sort of considerations relevant to data embassies?
I think mostly it's a question of value alignment again. We agreed pretty early that Luxembourgish law would apply in case of disputes. And I'm optimistic that if countries have such good diplomatic relations that they think even about hosting critical data in another country and trust the partner, then they could also agree on which jurisdiction applies and so on. In most cases, it would be reasonable to expect that it is the jurisdiction of the host country that applies, and this was also the case with different countries we discussed with. That was the first idea that the jurisdiction should lie within the host country.
Was it a matter of party autonomy, do you think? So parties should get to choose, or do you think there should be a specific connecting factor as to why you're saying the host country should be the law that applies?
I think it's a matter of discussion and a matter of parties to agree what applies. But for us, it felt right to go to that direction, and also I should bring in the Vienna Convention here on diplomatic relations. I think there is no government that wants to test whether Vienna Convention would apply to this kind of concept or not, and also the agreement between Estonian government and the government of Luxembourg was done in the light of Vienna Convention, and trying to adopt those principles into the agreement. But no government wants to test this in court. But I'm more than happy that now the legal scholars of the governments are discussing those topics, and maybe at some point it becomes international customary law.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, I'm actually, it's quite interesting because, of course, as lawyers, we want to make sure that things don't go to a dispute. So, there is no real dispute to resolve. But I'm just wondering, in your experience, you mentioned, for example, testing things in court. Are you aware as to whether there is a preferred method of dispute resolution for parties engaged in the data embassy arrangement? And if so, what is this method and how did it emerge as a preference?
I would say that all the disputes would be solved through diplomatic channels, and also it's important to note that only the authorized representatives of both governments can exchange notices on the implementation of the agreement. I have been asked very many times this question, like, how would you solve the disputes? And I think that when we are already in the situation we have a dispute and we haven't picked the right partner, we haven't been the right partner ourselves, we haven't behaved in a way that we would be respected enough. So it's more about diplomatic relations, diplomatic channels, and also what was very important for us in choosing the host country was that we belong to the same international organizations, let's say NATO, European Union, so that there would be more diplomatic channels to solve the issues.
Thank you, Laura. We're always, of course, speaking about the data embassy that's from one country in another, as you say, more in a public to public kind of cooperation. Just in your experience, do you think that this will pivot towards a more public-private type of cooperation? So basically having a data host that is a private entity in a separate country, do you think that will be something that will move towards?
It might happen, but again, I feel it depends on the data categorization, so what kind of data is hosted. But I believe that like the core essence of data embassy, hosting data critical to the functioning of the state still should belong to the bilateral agreements between governments. And I think it's more like a government-to-government project.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, do you think there are barriers to participation? So, for example, what are your views on accessibility of data embassies as a method for data hosting and for information hosting, given the varied level of internet and other digital infrastructure in different countries, or maybe other legal limitations, for example? Could you maybe just walk us through some of the more, obvious barriers to participation?
I think technological hurdles are per se not very high. Of course, there needs to be a basic level of network existent, but data embassy could even be filled with scanned in paper documents. And there are very many countries who would need this kind of solution because of natural disasters, for example, hurricanes in the Caribbean region, let's say, where governments' archives are destroyed every now and then. So the benefits of secure backup remain, and they are not that dependent on the level of on the technical level of the government. However, this would create a high bureaucratic burden to keep the backup up to date. So that's why having the live copy of an information system or data base makes more sense. And for us as well, in the very first stages, it was a backup, and then we moved forward with technical solutions so that it would be a live hosting of service from our data embassy. So the more digitized the society is, the easier it would be to implement such a solution, of course. And also it becomes more and more attractive, but also the need is higher. From the legal perspective, the primary question is whether personal data of citizens and residents alike can be stored outside countries' borders. And I think there lies the main question of whether you can host data abroad or not.
Right. No, I think that's actually tremendous, because when we're talking also about data security, for even people's private data or medical data, things that you and I as private citizens would like to keep to ourselves, and having the idea that this would be then in a foreign jurisdiction in a different country might take some getting used to, let's say. But thank you so much for your insight on that, Laura. Maybe just to perhaps, in view of the time, just to kind of maybe end on a more personal note, I'm just wondering, in the data embassy space or in the digital space in the next 3 to 5 years, what's the development that excites you most? Where do you think we're going to go? What's the most exciting?
What I hope most, and what I have been hoping since 2014 when I started with the project, is that I would have other experts, other scholars to share those ideas, to discuss this topic. I'm also doing a PhD at Tartu University connected to those topics. So I'm more than happy that there are like-minded people, that there are scholars and other governments who follow the route Estonia took, and maybe challenge this as well, challenge the way we did it, do it differently, come up with better solutions, better maybe understanding of legal framework. So I like to call myself a legal engineer, not a lawyer. So I think this project was one of my masterpieces in a way, that you had to come up with something that was not existing before, and there weren't many to copy from. And I think also on the EU level and around the globe, the topic is gaining more and more traction. Also because of the situation we have at the moment globally, having the COVID virus, the need to access information from digital channels. So I'm more than happy that this topic has gained attention of scholars like you, and also your board of experts. So happy to contribute.
Oh, we're so glad to have you, actually, Laura. So thank you so much for your time and for your expertise today. This session obviously will be one of the great inputs, into this conference. So we look forward to having a continued conversation with you on the matter of data embassies, data transactions across borders, and so on. But it leaves me to thank you very much for being with us, Laura, and to express the hope that we will continue working together on these matters. So we will reach out to you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting, and if you have any other questions, then please reach out, find me on LinkedIn, and more than happy to discuss further.
We're going to do so. So thank you so much, Laura.